Welcome to the Monday Monologue. Well, we're doing something really exciting right now. Something I'm excited about is doing some output transformer rolling. And I know this is something most people can't afford to do, and so I'm doing it for you. We're going to take this 2A3 amp, and I've got this whole row of 3.5K output transformer single-ended guys that we're going to be rolling into this amp. We've got them over here set up with some loose wires here so we can swap them in and out, and then run the analog discovery tool on them and see what the difference is. And one of the viewers, Oak Mountain Man, sent me these Hashimoto ones to add to the shootout, so appreciate that. That's going to be fun. And what I wanted to talk about this week is something I've been involved with a debate on DIY audio about, is heating these direct heated triodes. And basically there's three different ways of heating them that seem to be popular. One of them is just to use AC heaters, and that's what I did on my 2A3 amp. And I'm using these 10-turn hum pots so that, historically, if you just use like the little, 120 degree or the 270 degree potentiometers, you just breathe on the adjustment, and the, hum rating or the hum balancing jumps a mile. And I've been using these 10-turn pots, so you got a very fine adjustment on them. So something I tried was, my friend Mystery Mark had me get my flute meter and set it to the millivolt scale and adjust the hum pot on the outputs with, reading the milliamps of AC. And even with this 10-turn pot, just like one little, like you can feel the little minute clicks, just one little tiny click, it would move a pretty good bit. And the audible range was like from here, it was like probably a 45 degree to almost 90 degree range. But then when you're measuring it to get the like very minimum millivolts, it took this 10-turn pot, and I could get it almost to nothing. I can't remember. It seems like it was down to almost like 1 or 2 milliamps, which is not going to be audible, even with super efficient speakers. So the other thing people are doing is using DC heaters, and that's what I did on my 300B amp. And then I was using a voltage regulator on the output of the rectification to further remove the ripple, more so than even regulating the voltage. And some of you folks may know that when you put a voltage regulator in a DC, there is a ton of ripple rejection on the output versus the input. So the third kind, that there's these Rod Coleman regulators, and some other folks are doing the same thing or similar thing, of using a current source or using a current regulation. And you set the output voltage of this current regulator, with the tubes hooked up to whatever voltage they're supposed to be. I haven't used them, but I understand that's how they do it. And they're not actually measuring the current across the tube. They're measuring the current across of an external resistor, and then they're claiming that that's not then in the signal and stuff. And they were talking about with AC heating, there's like this IM distortion, but it was showing it like negative 50 dBs below the signal, or I think it was below just idle, when there's no signal. And it's like, really, you guys can hear stuff that's negative 50 dBs below the idle signal? I mean, there's more noise than that just in the hiss from the tubes themselves. And then we were talking about the using like a LM1085 voltage regulator, the 5 volt guys, and there are folks, oh yeah, that's just the noise on the output of those is just too much. And went through and did the math. It's negative 111 dBs. It's like, you're never going to hear that. And so some of this stuff just doesn't sound believable to me. But what all this got me thinking about, because I really have dove into this whole direct heated triodes, mostly because of you guys and my customers keep going, 300B, 300B, I want a 300B, where's the 300B, I want a 300B, I'm just like, okay, we're gonna do 300B stuff, everybody's screaming about wanting a 300B. When you look at the way the heaters have been done, I personally haven't tried using just straight up 60 hertz AC heaters on a 300B tube. And I was shocked that I could get these just dead silent. There's nothing. And I don't have, 105 dB efficient speakers, so I can't claim that nobody would ever hear them, sticking your ear up to a speaker that's that efficient. But I'm not hearing anything. And like I said, there's, a pretty good range of this hum pot where I don't hear anything. And then I can measure, and getting it in the center, I know you're not going to hear anything. And some people say that 300Bs with AC heaters are fine. But then other people say you can't get the hum out of them. And that's why I went with DC heaters. So this got me to thinking, though, about with DC heaters on a direct heated triode, you do have a 5-volt difference between one end of the filament and the other. And it's not just the filament is the cathode. So forget about like heating the filament. If we think about that piece of wire is the cathode, that you've got 5 volts of variation across one end to the other of it, which is 5 volts of bias, which is a pretty good bit of variation. And the bias is the difference between the voltage potential on the cathode versus the grid. And so if there's 5 volts difference when you have, let's say like on this, let's say you have, 50 volts of bias. That's a pretty good, that's 10% of the bias. And even if you have 80 volts, that's a pretty good bit of difference from one side of the cathode to the other. So given this voltage disparity across the width of the cathode using DC heaters versus AC, it's made me think about that maybe there is something that AC heaters are really better than going with DC heaters, and trying to figure out another way of sidestepping this hum issue, if it even is an issue. And that's one of the things I want to experiment with. Is I do have a Hammond transformer that has 5-volt AC heaters for the 300B tubes. And I want to try building one of those 300B amps with these 10-turn hum pots and just running straight up 5-volt AC heaters and see if there really is noise for myself instead of just what I've read online. And then I can report to you guys, yes, 5-volt AC heaters are noisy, 2.5-volt ones you can manage, but 5 volts are too much. And if that's the case, I've been talking with my friend Andrew over at Sparkos that does a lot of solid state stuff about coming up with some kind of a circuit board electronics that would generate 5 volts AC, but instead of at 60 hertz, have it running at like 30k hertz. And that's totally outside of the audible range, and I honestly don't think it would make any difference whether it was a sine wave or like a chopped square wave kind of a thing when you're talking about 30k hertz. And heat the heaters up with that using a frequency that, obviously isn't going to be audible, but you still have the even voltage relatively across the whole filament, because you'd be going 2.5 positive, 2.5 negative with AC. So you're never, it's 5 volts across the whole thing instead of having a 5 volt shift. And it's cycling back and forth, which I think would make it easier on the heaters themselves, that the have an even voltage across them, so even bias, because I've read that one side of the cathode's going to be dissipating more than the other side if you're using DC. It's one reason with my 300B amps, I make the tubes where like you can pull one out, and when you put it in the other socket, the voltage is reversed. And so you can swap the tubes from one side to the other in my DC heated amps so that you can even out the, wear or the life of the tube. But yeah, that's something I've been thinking about recently. And I know people say that, everything that's been done with tubes has already been done 30 years ago. I still think there's some things that can be done differently today that is new and is different. And, I think, or hopefully we've been doing some stuff on the channel that's kind of fun and new and different. And to that end, the other thing that I'm thinking about working on as I'm dealing with these 300B amps and stuff for folks and for the channel, is working on a push-pull that runs off a balanced input. And it's a true differential amplifier that, it doesn't have RCA and balanced. It's just got balanced. And that it eliminates the phase splitter. And that we just run a driver tube as a voltage amp that goes into an output tube that then goes into a push-pull output transformer. So basically what it ends up being is 2 single-ended amps on each channel that then get summed into one output that's that channel, if that makes sense, because a true balanced input should be like phase split already. And so it eliminates like a redundant phase splitter, because a lot of these tube amps that I see that have balanced inputs, they have a balanced input that then goes through a transformer that recombines the 2 signals into one, that then becomes single-ended, goes into a phase splitter, and then back out to the tubes, and then back again. And that seems crazy. And I think you need to make up your mind. You either want balanced input or single-ended input. And one of the things I never really cared for about push-pull amps was that whole phase splitter thing. And so, given that a lot of audio sources, especially DACs, are going to balanced outputs, it makes sense to have a balanced input integrated tube amp. And the problem with doing a true balanced preamp is you basically are just doubling the amount of parts and tubes and everything. You're making basically a stereo preamp can be used as a mono preamp, and you need to double it. If that makes sense, for it to stay truly balanced, and you're not doing this whole conversion to single and back to balanced, which anytime you're splitting the signal and then recombining it and then splitting it again, it's just asking for trouble. So I've got an EL84 amp that I built, a couple of mono blocks, and I did it a long time ago, and they sound okay, but they were just not anything really special to me. And I think that the problem was the way that the phase splitting and stuff was done really isn't optimal, and doing it as a balanced or a differential amp, it could really sound good. And it's really not a big lift to do that. The trick's figuring out how to do the whole feedback loop. Historically, people have especially on push-pull amps, they want to use global negative feedback. You can't do that with a differential amp because you've got basically two separate input signals. You get the positive and the negative. There's nowhere to pull that differential signal off of the output of the output transformer because it's reassembling the differential signal into a single output to go to the speaker. But you can use shade feedback, and you guys know I love using shade feedback. So that may be what we end up doing, is using shade feedback in a differential amp with balanced inputs. And I've got some DACs, got a topping E70 that has I think my Centaurus has balanced out too. So the other thing that I've been thinking about messing with as well, because I know a lot of you folks are like, we want to do some push-pull stuff. I really was impressed with that ST70, but especially when I ran it as a single channel. And when we tested it with a single channel, those EL34 tubes were 50 watts of output, which is freaking impressive out of some EL34 tubes. But then when you run both channels at the same time, it drops down to 35 watts. So that's telling me that the power supply can't keep up. And I don't think it is just the fact that it's got a tube rectifier. I think the whole problem is the whole chain of the transformer, everything just can't keep up with the milliamp load when the amp really starts making power. So what I've been thinking about doing is, I know people love, these KT88, KT120 super high power amps. I want to see what kind of power I can really get out of a pair of EL34 tubes doing a super stiff power supply. And by that, I mean probably going to use like a really oversized power transformer. Not just enough to cover the milliamps with it, the bias points, but probably double that. And then, which may end up being monoblocks. I don't know yet. But I'm thinking about doing like solid state rectifier. Might use a tubelin, not sure yet. Definitely going to use a choke input instead of a capacitor input. And that really stabilizes the voltage versus using a capacitor input filtering setup. And got to do some more research on that. I got some ideas of, I want to talk to some folks that make transformers about like what it's going to take to, have a choke input choke that can deal with that without humming or overheating, and because it definitely puts a lot of stress on the choke, but it does take a lot of stress off the power transformer. And I feel like that I should be able to build some really dynamic sounding push-pull amplifiers that put out 50 watts per channel using some inexpensive EL34 tubes instead of having to use like more expensive tubes. And honestly, I feel like the EL34 tubes have a nicer, smoother sound than some of those higher powered beam tubes do. So that's some more kind of outside the box thinking and stuff projects that I want to do in the future, along with some of the other stuff I've been talking about, like working with these acro sound transformers. Hey, we might do some crazy different power supply kind of a thing using those acro sound transformers instead of just using the old capacitor input stuff and having super low wattage power out of them, because I don't think that's the limit of the transformers. I think it's more that the power supply can't keep up. And clearly those ST70 transformers that Habu is making are up to the task and aren't overly expensive. So, could end up being a fairly low budget thing that you can make the same power that a KT88 push-pull amp makes out of some EL34 tubes by using a proper power supply. So anyway, that's just some kind of stuff I've been thinking about in the background. And yeah, I did my rant last week on AI, so I'm going to stay out of doing any kind of crazy rants this week. As far as the music suggestions, I'm going to say more about a album company or a pressing company that I've gained a lot of respect for. I've bought several of these music on vinyl. I call them MOV branded vinyl, and you can find them on eBay. I've been buying some that are sealed new in the package for reasonable prices, and they all sound really good. They've got great, the low surface noise and all that kind of stuff. They're very dynamic sounding, and I know somebody's going to say in the comments, yeah, they're making those off of digital files. I don't care. It's great sounding vinyl. I don't care how they get there. It doesn't matter to me. I'm not that purist that's like it's got to be this total analog chain. And I know some of you say you can hear the difference. Yeah, I just like that really crisp dynamic sound that I get out of good vinyl. And I don't care where it comes from. Have been playing with some phono cartridges. I was kind of disappointed with a pretty high-end one. I bought a Koetsu black line that had a line contact stylus and stuff, and I was really expecting it to just sound really good. And yeah, it sounds... It's probably my tone arm. And I'm probably trying to put a cartridge on it that's got the wrong compliance, which is something I need to learn more about. But I think I screwed up and got the wrong kind of cartridge for my Technique's tone arm. And so, luckily, I got a really good price on it. It was retail for like $3,300, and I got it for $1,500-ish. I think maybe $1,700, and it looks like that I should be able to sell it on eBay for at least that much. And so, I think I'm going to flip that over. And it's one of the things I've kind of learned about audio too, is that sometimes there's some investment, sometimes you lose money trying to find that right setup. I've spent thousands of dollars on speakers to finally settle on these Quad S2s. And then I actually found for MoFi, they had one pair left that were some B-stock that I bought just kind of for backup, that I know these sound good. And I did the same thing with that OC9 MXL phono cartridge that I love. I bought another one just, hey, if they quit making these, I've got one in shrink wrap waiting. And especially for stuff like tubes or consumable stuff that you know wears out, if you've got something you like, you probably should buy a backup because they may not keep making them forever. So that's my tip for the week is, yeah, if you got something you really love, make sure you've got a backup for when it wears out or quits working. So anyway, I think that's going to be it for the Monday monologue this week. A note, this is the 150th Monday monologue that I've recorded. Woo! And that's kind of exciting. I would have never thought when I made the first one, I was like, nobody's going to like these. And people seem to love the Monday monologue. So I'm going to try to keep making them every week. I know sometimes I miss a week or two here and there, but I try to be fairly consistent putting out a Monday video. So here's the one for this week. So I want to thank all you folks that regularly view my videos. Thanks to all you folks that subscribe to the channel. It's cool to be past 20K. That's awesome. Thanks for all you folks that have joined my Patreon, buy my stuff or otherwise support the channel. Folks that, like Oak Mountain Man, been a friend of mine for a while. I appreciate him and his wife. I hope she's doing okay. And for sending this over for me to throw into the shootout. And lending me gear. Like somebody lent me a pair of JJ 300B tubes that we're going to stick in my 300B amp and do a quick video on that versus the other one kind of as a supplement and run the same tests on it and say, hey, here's what these JJ tubes look like. and listen to them and give a little opinion kind of review on those. Got some other new tubes in the pipeline that we're going to be doing some reviews on, so that's going to be exciting. And it's always nice for the companies like AYIMA and some other folks that have, sent gear to me to review. I think y'all appreciate being able to see that kind of stuff, so we'll try to keep all that rolling too, do some more reviews soon. And we will see you next week for the Monday Monologue.